The bustling diner sat at the corner of Maple Street, just like it had for decades. Richard Blackwell, CEO of Blackwell Industries, adjusted his expensive silk tie and glared at his gold watch. He hated waiting, but the stain on his pristine suit from the coffee spill earlier gnawed at him more. He had been coming to Murphy's Diner for years, a place his father had taken him as a child, and tonight something felt off. It wasn't the food. It wasn't the decor. It was the waitress, the one who had ruined his $2,000 jacket with a clumsy spill. She apologized too many times, almost making him feel guilty for even being upset. But the truth was, Richard Blackwell wasn't a man who tolerated mistakes. The waiter, who had worked here for months, had been clumsy, inattentive, and just off. The spill was a small thing, but for Richard, it was a symbol of something larger, a lack of care, a lack of professionalism. Where are you watching from tonight? Leave a comment below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this. The bell above the diner door rang as Richard entered again the following evening. The air smelled of fresh bacon and greasy fries, a familiar comfort, but tonight it felt like an obligation. He had already spoken to Murphy, the owner, and he had made it clear. One more complaint and she was gone. "Evening, Mr. Blackwell," called Murphy from behind the grill, smiling as if he didn't know his customer was here on business. "Your usual boots ready." Richard didn't respond, just nodded curtly and walked toward his spot, a booth with cracked red vinyl seats that had been his father's and his for years, a place full of memories now tainted by frustration. His usual coffee arrived, black as requested, and then she came, the same waitress from the previous night, her auburn hair falling loosely from a messy ponytail. She looked even more tired now, but there was something about her, an edge of vulnerability he hadn't noticed before. She didn't look like the careless worker he had expected. No, there was something deeper, something worn and worn out in her eyes. She was genuinely kind, helping others, remembering everyone's orders, moving between tables with a quiet grace. The elderly Mrs. Henderson at the back booth struggling with her purse, Sarah was there, offering a hand, her smile effortless and warm. Richard had been wrong about her, but the mistake with the coffee, it still bothered him. He couldn't let it go. Not yet. At closing time, Sarah walked over to him again. "Can I get you anything else, Mr. Blackwell?" asked her voice soft. Richard's gaze held hers for a moment before he pulled out his business card and slid it across the table. "I think you and I need to have a conversation tomorrow after your shift." Her eyes widened as she read the card, her face growing pale. Have I done something wrong?" There was a tremor in her voice, one Richard hadn't anticipated. This wasn't the satisfaction he had been expecting. Her fear tugged at something inside him.
But he had made his decision. "We'll talk tomorrow." She nodded and walked away, and Richard spent the next few minutes in silence, sipping his coffee, his thoughts tangled. As Sarah cleaned the last tables of the night, Richard watched her. This wasn't the careless waitress he had judged. No, she was something else entirely. At 10 p.m., the diner's lights flickered off, and Richard stepped outside into the cool night air. He was ready to follow her, see where she went. Maybe her life, her circumstances, would explain everything. Or maybe, just maybe, it would confirm his decision to fire her. 15 minutes later, Sarah emerged, now dressed in a faded sweater and worn jeans. She climbed into an old Honda, one that sputtered to life after several attempts. Richard, in his black Mercedes, followed from a distance. Her route took him by surprise. Instead of heading for one of the modest neighborhoods he'd expected, Sarah drove past the shopping centers, the nice homes, to a part of town he rarely ventured. The streets grew narrower, the houses smaller. But she didn't stop at any of them. Instead, Sarah pulled into the parking lot of Mercy General Hospital and hurried inside. Richard sat in his car, confused. Was she sick? Was someone she loved in trouble? The assumptions he had made about her were starting to unravel. A full hour later, Richard couldn't resist his curiosity. He walked through the hospital's front entrance, down the sterile hallways, trying to piece together what was going on. And then he found her. In a small pediatric room, Sarah sat beside a young boy in a hospital bed. A little boy, no more than 7, with tubes running from his nose. Richard watched, frozen, as Sarah read aloud from a well-worn book, her voice animated despite her exhaustion. The boy smiled weakly at her efforts, even though his body was clearly weak from illness. "Is that Sarah's son?" Richard asked a nurse, his voice barely above a whisper. The nurse looked up and smiled kindly at him. "No, Mr. Blackwell, that's Tommy Martinez. Sarah's not his family, but she's been coming here every night for months now, ever since his mom couldn't be here," the nurse explained as she updated the boy's charts. Richard's heart clenched. This wasn't the careless waitress he had thought he knew. This was someone who had been quietly caring for a sick child for months. And not just any child. Tommy had been battling a severe heart condition for most of his life. A surgery was scheduled to save him, but the family couldn't afford the cost. "She's been helping him for months?" Richard asked, his voice thick with disbelief. "She works at the diner, doesn't she? And yet—" The nurse nodded. "She works multiple jobs, but she always comes here, even if it's just for a few minutes, every single night." Watching Sarah with Tommy, Richard's anger from the previous night dissolved. He saw the real picture now. Sarah wasn't irresponsible. She was carrying burdens far heavier than he could imagine. Sarah had been trying to make a difference in a child's life when most would have turned away. The nurse's voice brought him back to reality. "But it's not enough, Mr. Blackwell. Tommy's surgery costs more than his family can afford. It's a hard truth." Richard didn't know what to think anymore. This wasn't just about spilled coffee. This was about sacrifice. A woman struggling to get by, finding the strength to care for a child in need. And Richard? He'd been angry over a jacket. "I'll pay for Tommy's surgery," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I'm not stopping there."